The decision to lock Annabelle away was not driven by panic, urgency, or a single catastrophic incident. It was driven by accumulation. Investigators did not wake up one day and decide containment was necessary. They arrived at that conclusion slowly, through repeated confirmation, that ordinary interaction, even cautious, limited interaction, consistently altered conditions in undesirable ways. Locking Annabelle away was not a reaction. It was a conclusion reached after every alternative had failed. At first, containment was informal. Distance was maintained. Interaction was reduced. The object was treated as something to be monitored rather than engaged. These measures produced partial stability, but never permanence. Stability held only as long as attention remained minimal. Any deviation, curiosity, discussion, testing, produced subtle but measurable effects. Investigators recognized that the margin for error was too small. A system that collapses under minimal deviation cannot be managed casually. It must be isolated. One of the most important factors leading to permanent containment was predictability. Annabelle's responses followed recognizable patterns. Increased attention led to increased activity. Reduced engagement led to stabilization. This predictability eliminated uncertainty about cause. Investigators no longer debated whether interaction mattered. They knew it did. The remaining question was how to eliminate interaction reliably, not just intentionally. Human discipline, they concluded, was insufficient on its own. Human behavior is inconsistent by nature. Curiosity resurfaces, doubt returns. New individuals enter the environment without context. Even well-trained professionals are subject to fatigue and normalization. Investigators realized that relying on perpetual discipline was unrealistic. A system that depends entirely on perfect behavior will eventually fail. Permanent containment was a way to remove human variability from the equation as much as possible. The phrase, "locked away forever," is often misunderstood as dramatic exaggeration. In reality, it reflects a conservative operational choice. The goal was not punishment or theatrical isolation. The goal was environmental control. Locking Annabelle away reduced variables. It limited visual exposure, physical proximity, and casual observation. Each of these factors had been identified as inputs. Removing inputs stabilized the system. Investigators also understood that containment served a symbolic function. Physical barriers communicate seriousness more effectively than warnings. A locked enclosure conveys that something is not meant to be interacted with. This message operates even when context is incomplete. Someone encountering a locked object instinctively understands restraint. This instinct reduces the likelihood of casual engagement. Casual engagement had proven to be the most persistent risk factor in the case. Another reason permanent containment became necessary was transfer risk. As long as Annabelle remained in environments associated with daily life, relocation introduced danger. Movement altered conditions. New spaces meant new variables. New variables increased unpredictability. Locking Annabelle away in a controlled, dedicated environment reduced the need for movement entirely. Stability favored immobility. Once this principle was recognized, permanence became logical. The containment decision was also influenced by comparative analysis. Investigators reviewed other cases where objects had been repeatedly relocated rather than isolated. Those cases showed higher rates of reemergence. Each relocation reset conditions and introduced new opportunities for engagement. Annabelle's case had already demonstrated sensitivity to change. There was no justification for continuing a practice that consistently produced instability. Importantly, locking Annabelle away was not presented as a solution. Investigators did not claim that containment neutralized risk completely. They described it as risk reduction. The objective was to minimize interaction to the lowest feasible level. Total elimination of risk was never claimed. This honesty mattered. Overconfidence had already been identified as dangerous. Containment was framed as management, not victory. The decision also reflected a shift in investigative identity. Investigators accepted that their role was not to resolve the case definitively, but to prevent escalation indefinitely. This required abandoning the desire for closure. Locking Annabelle away was a commitment to maintenance rather than resolution. It acknowledged that some conditions cannot be ended safely, only controlled. There was also a temporal consideration. As years passed, the likelihood of contextual loss increased. Future caretakers would not share first-hand experience. For them, rules would exist without memory. Physical containment provided continuity across time. It enforced boundaries even when understanding faded. This feature made containment uniquely suited for long-term stewardship. The permanence of containment also protected against reinterpretation. Objects left accessible invite reassessment. Reassessment leads to experimentation. Experimentation alters conditions. By locking Annabelle away, investigators removed the invitation. The case no longer asked to be understood. It demanded to be respected. This shift reduced cognitive engagement as well as physical interaction. The choice of containment was therefore the outcome of pattern recognition, not fear. It was the most conservative option available after every less restrictive measure proved insufficient. Investigators concluded that as long as Annabelle remained accessible, the system would remain vulnerable. Accessibility was the problem. Containment addressed it directly. Understanding why Annabelle was locked away forever requires recognizing that permanence was not symbolic. It was practical. Temporary measures rely on sustained vigilance. Permanent measures rely on structure. Structure outlasts individuals. In a case defined by endurance, structure mattered more than intent. This first part establishes the logic behind the decision. Annabelle was not locked away because of what she did in a single moment. She was locked away because of what consistently happened whenever interaction was allowed to resume. The pattern was clear. The response followed inevitably. The next phase will examine how containment was designed, what principles guided its construction, and why even small details of isolation were considered critical to maintaining long-term stability. Designing Annabelle's containment required a shift from reactive thinking to systems engineering. Investigators were no longer asking how to respond if something happened. They were asking how to prevent conditions that allowed anything to happen at all. This distinction guided every design choice. The enclosure was not built to withstand force. It was built to eliminate interaction. Physical strength mattered less than behavioral influence. The goal was not to trap, but to disengage. One of the first principles adopted was visibility control. Investigators had learned that simple observation functioned as engagement. Looking was not neutral. Prolonged viewing correlated with heightened attention, discussion, and emotional response. The enclosure therefore limited sightlines. Annabelle could be seen, but not studied casually. This balance mattered. Complete concealment would invite curiosity. Total exposure would invite fixation. Controlled visibility communicated restriction without provocation. Material selection was equally deliberate. The enclosure was designed to feel final, not temporary. Temporary structures invite re-evaluation. Permanent materials signal conclusion without declaring closure. This subtle psychological cue discouraged testing. Investigators understood that humans interpret material cues instinctively. A solid barrier conveys seriousness more effectively than warnings or instructions. The enclosure's construction reinforced the idea that interaction was not part of its function. Another critical consideration was access hierarchy. Not everyone who encountered the case required the same level of proximity. Access was tiered. Only essential personnel were permitted near the enclosure, and even then under defined conditions. This hierarchy reduced the number of potential interactions dramatically. Fewer interactions meant fewer variables. Fewer variables increased predictability. Predictability was the closest thing to safety the case allowed. The enclosure also addressed sound, movement, and routine. Investigators noted that environmental rhythms influenced perception. A space that felt active invited attention. A space that felt static discouraged it. The containment environment was therefore designed to minimize change. Lighting remained consistent. Layout remained fixed. Routine visits followed predictable schedules. Predictability reduced salience. Salience had previously amplified engagement. This design choice transformed the enclosure into a neutral background rather than a focal point. Another design principle focused on symbolic closure without narrative closure. The enclosure communicated, "Do not interact," without explaining why in detail. Over-explanation invites analysis. Analysis invites curiosity. Curiosity invites engagement. Investigators deliberately avoided framing the enclosure as mysterious. It was presented as procedural, ordinary, functional. This framing reduced the temptation to assign meaning. Meaning had always been a driver of interaction. Investigators also accounted for time as a variable. Over long periods, novelty fades. What remains is routine. Routine can breed complacency. To counter this, the enclosure's protocols emphasized consistency rather than intensity. There were no dramatic rituals, no escalating precautions. Everything remained deliberately uneventful. Uneventfulness discouraged reinterpretation. If nothing changes, there is nothing to question. This monotony was intentional. Another important aspect of containment was documentation discipline. Records related to the enclosure focused on maintenance rather than speculation. Logs tracked condition, not interpretation. This prevented documentation from becoming a narrative source. Investigators had already learned that stories could function as indirect engagement. By keeping records technical and minimal, they reduced the risk that documentation itself would invite renewed attention. The enclosure also served as a training tool. New personnel encountered it early, framed not as a mystery, but as a responsibility. The message was clear. This exists because interaction produces instability. No further justification was required. This framing established expectations before curiosity could form. It aligned behavior preemptively rather than reactively. One of the most subtle design considerations involved inevitability. Investigators accepted that no system is immune to human error. Someone, eventually, would question restrictions. The enclosure was designed to absorb minor lapses without cascading failure. A brief glance would not destabilize conditions. A momentary proximity would not reset the system. This tolerance mattered. A system that fails catastrophically under minor deviation invites secrecy and fear. A system that tolerates small errors without response discourages escalation. This tolerance, however, had limits. Prolonged engagement remained the primary risk factor. The enclosure reduced the likelihood of prolonged engagement by default. It did not rely on constant enforcement. Structure replaced supervision. This shift reduced cognitive load on caretakers and lowered the chance of drift over time. Comparative analysis reinforced these choices. Other cases that relied on behavioral rules alone showed gradual erosion. Rules were bent, reinterpreted, or forgotten. Physical structures endured. The Annabelle enclosure embodied this lesson. It was not built to impress. It was built to persist. Persistence mattered more than immediacy. The containment design also reflected humility. Investigators did not assume they understood the phenomenon fully. They designed for unknowns. The enclosure limited interaction regardless of interpretation. Whether the phenomenon responded to attention, emotion, or proximity, the enclosure reduced all three. This redundancy increased confidence without requiring explanation. Importantly, the enclosure was never framed as impenetrable. Investigators avoided language of absolutes. Absolutes invite challenge. Instead, the enclosure was described as sufficient. Sufficient to reduce risk. Sufficient to maintain stability. This modest framing discouraged testing. There was no claim to disprove, only a system to maintain. By this stage, containment had become less about Annabelle herself and more about what she represented. The enclosure embodied a philosophy. When interaction itself is the hazard, isolation is not dramatic, it is rational. The structure reflected lessons learned through repetition rather than speculation. This second part shows that locking Annabelle away was not an act of fear, but of design. Every element served to minimize engagement, normalize restraint, and outlast individual vigilance. The enclosure did not end the case, it stabilized it. The next and final part will examine what containment changed and what it did not. Why locking Annabelle away reduced risk without eliminating it, and why permanence was chosen not because it promised safety, but because it acknowledged limits honestly. What containment changed was measurable. What it did not change was equally important. After Annabelle was locked away permanently, escalation ceased. Not immediately, but decisively. The fluctuations that once followed attention, relocation, or renewed discussion no longer appeared. Environmental instability diminished. Behavioral tension subsided. The system entered a sustained state of equilibrium. Investigators did not interpret this as elimination. They interpreted it as confirmation. The enclosure worked because it removed the variables that had consistently driven response. Interaction had been the catalyst. Containment interrupted it. However, investigators were careful not to misread this outcome. Stability did not mean neutrality. The absence of incidents did not imply that the underlying mechanism had disappeared. It implied that it no longer had access. This distinction shaped long-term expectations. Containment was effective precisely because it acknowledged limitation. It did not attempt to solve the phenomenon. It constrained it. One of the most important changes introduced by containment was predictability. Before isolation, the case was reactive. Activity followed behavior, but behavior varied. After containment, conditions stabilized because behavior was no longer a variable. Predictability allowed for consistent management. Investigators could plan maintenance without anticipating escalation. This reliability reduced cognitive strain and prevented the cycles of doubt that had previously undermined discipline. At the same time, investigators noted that containment did not erase psychological effects entirely. Individuals who had experienced prolonged exposure prior to isolation reported lingering sensitivity, heightened awareness, residual discomfort in similar environments. These effects faded gradually but never vanished completely. Investigators understood this as evidence that the system had extended beyond physical proximity. Behavior had adapted. Adaptation persisted. Containment could prevent new influence, but it could not retroactively undo adaptation. This realization reinforced the decision for permanence. Temporary containment would have addressed symptoms without addressing risk. If access were restored, even briefly, conditions could shift again. The system had already demonstrated sensitivity to small changes. There was no justification for reintroducing variability. Permanence reduced the probability of regression to near zero. In risk management, reducing probability matters more than achieving certainty. Another outcome of containment was administrative clarity. Once Annabelle was locked away, the case's purpose became singular: maintenance. There was no longer debate about next steps, no temptation to test hypotheses, no pressure to pursue resolution. This clarity removed ambiguity from decision-making. Ambiguity had previously invited engagement under the guise of investigation. With containment in place, engagement lost justification. Importantly, containment also altered how fear functioned. Fear no longer drove action, structure did. This reduced emotional fluctuation among caretakers. Emotional responses had previously contributed to instability. By replacing emotional vigilance with procedural routine, containment improved consistency. Consistency had always been correlated with stability. However, investigators also recognized what containment did not protect against: reinterpretation over time. As years passed without incident, the rationale for isolation risked being questioned by those without direct experience. Documentation addressed this risk, but documentation alone could not replicate memory. Investigators therefore treated containment as a physical reminder. The enclosure itself communicated seriousness more effectively than records ever could. It embodied accumulated caution. Another limitation of containment involved external narratives. Public fascination continued independently of internal management. Films, discussions, and reinterpretations circulated without regard for procedure. While this attention did not directly breach containment, it created future risk. Someone, eventually, might approach the case influenced more by narrative than by protocol. Investigators accepted that this risk could not be eliminated. Containment reduced exposure internally. It could not regulate perception externally. This acceptance further justified permanence. Since external variables could not be controlled, Internal variables had to be minimized absolutely. Accessibility was the most controllable variable. Locking Annabelle away addressed it decisively. Investigators understood that no amount of explanation could replace structural restraint. Another subtle change introduced by containment was the elimination of escalation incentives. Before isolation, activity itself provided feedback. Something happened. Someone responded. Response created meaning. Meaning invited further attention. Containment broke this loop. Nothing happened. There was nothing to respond to. Without feedback, engagement lost momentum. Over time, even internal curiosity diminished. Silence became normal. This silence, however, required reinterpretation. Silence could not be framed as success alone. Investigators treated it as maintenance outcome, a stable state that depended on continued restraint. This framing prevented complacency. Silence did not signal safety. It signaled correct conditions. Changing conditions would change outcomes. This understanding remained central to long-term stewardship. Containment also clarified the ethical dimension of the case. Investigators accepted that curiosity-driven exploration was incompatible with responsibility. Locking Annabelle away represented a moral choice as much as an operational one. It prioritized harm prevention over knowledge acquisition. This choice aligned with the lessons of the case. Knowledge had always come at a cost. The cost was no longer acceptable. By this stage, Annabelle's role had shifted again. She was no longer an active case study. She was a controlled reference. Her presence informed policy without demanding attention. This transformation reduced risk while preserving institutional memory. The enclosure functioned as both barrier and archive. The third phase of this story shows that containment worked not because it was dramatic, but because it was boring. Boring systems persist. Dramatic systems invite challenge. The enclosure was intentionally uneventful. It offered nothing to test, nothing to provoke, nothing to reinterpret. In doing so, it achieved the only outcome that had ever proven sustainable: long-term stability. The final question remained unresolved. If containment was necessary forever, what did that imply about the nature of the case itself? The final part will address this implication, why investigators concluded that forever was not exaggeration, but an honest assessment of risk across time. The word forever was not chosen lightly. Investigators are trained to avoid absolutes, especially in cases defined by uncertainty. Yet in the Annabelle case, permanence was not rhetorical, it was analytical. Forever reflected the conclusion that no future condition could be identified under which reintroduction would be safe. This conclusion did not come from fear of escalation, but from absence of evidence for decay. Nothing observed over time suggested that the underlying mechanism weakened, exhausted itself, or resolved naturally. Stability depended entirely on sustained conditions. Remove those conditions, and the system would respond again. This realization reframed time itself as a non-variable. Many risks diminish with distance. Annabelle's did not. Years passed without incident, but only because containment remained intact. Investigators found no correlation between duration and reduction of sensitivity. The system did not appear to age. It did not lose responsiveness. It simply waited. Waiting, investigators understood, was not a limitation. It was a feature. This made any future re-engagement unjustifiable. If time did not erode risk, then no future moment would be safer than the present. Another reason permanence was deemed necessary involved generational uncertainty. Investigators recognized that future caretakers would inherit responsibility without shared experience. Each generation would rely more heavily on documentation and structure. Over time, interpretive drift was inevitable. Procedures might remain, but their rationale could soften. Containment needed to survive that drift. A permanent enclosure imposed restraint even when understanding weakened. It functioned as a safeguard against reinterpretation by those removed from the original context. Investigators also considered the possibility of accidental exposure. As long as Annabelle remained accessible, even under supervision, the risk of error persisted. Accidents do not require intent. A lapse, a misunderstanding, or a moment of overconfidence could reintroduce interaction. Given the case's sensitivity to minimal engagement, even rare errors carried unacceptable risk. Permanence reduced exposure probability to its lowest feasible level. In risk management terms, this was sufficient justification. The decision was further reinforced by comparative longevity. Other cases with similar profiles but without permanent containment showed cycles of recurrence. Years of calm were followed by renewed disturbance when conditions changed. New environments, new people, new interpretations. Annabelle's case differed because those cycles stopped once isolation became permanent. This contrast was decisive. Permanence did not guarantee elimination, but it prevented recurrence. That outcome alone justified its adoption. There was also a philosophical acceptance underlying the decision. Investigators acknowledged that some systems cannot be exhausted or resolved through interaction. Attempting to finish such systems creates more data, but also more instability. Annabelle taught that knowledge acquisition had diminishing returns. At a certain point, additional understanding did not improve safety. It compromised it. Permanence represented the moment investigators chose restraint over inquiry definitively. The permanence of containment also addressed institutional continuity. Policies change, leadership changes, cultural attitudes shift, physical structures endure. By locking Annabelle away permanently, investigators anchored safety to something resistant to opinion. Even if future perspectives questioned the original rationale, the barrier would remain. Dismantling it would require a deliberate decision rather than passive drift. This raised the threshold for change appropriately. Importantly, forever did not mean abandonment. Maintenance continued. Oversight remained. Documentation was updated. The case stayed open. Permanence referred to access, not attention. Investigators did not forget Annabelle. They remembered her correctly by limiting interaction. This distinction preserved respect without fixation. It ensured that memory did not become curiosity. The permanence decision also clarified the ethical boundary of the case. At some point, continued exploration becomes irresponsible. Annabelle crossed that point early. Locking her away permanently acknowledged that the potential cost of renewed engagement outweighed any conceivable benefit. This ethical clarity simplified decision-making. There was no longer a question of when to re-engage. The answer was never. Over time, this clarity reduced internal tension. Caretakers no longer debated alternatives. Alternatives had been exhausted. Permanence was not one option among many. It was the only option consistent with observed outcomes. This acceptance allowed the case to stabilize not just operationally, but psychologically. Uncertainty diminished. Responsibility remained. The final implication of permanence is sobering. It suggests that the case cannot evolve toward resolution. There will be no closing chapter, no definitive explanation, no confirmation of elimination. The best achievable outcome has already been reached: stability through isolation. Investigators accepted that this outcome would persist indefinitely. Any attempt to improve upon it would introduce risk without justification. This acceptance runs counter to narrative instinct. Stories demand endings. Investigations demand conclusions. The Annabelle case demanded restraint instead. Locking her away forever was not an admission of defeat. It was recognition of limits. Limits of understanding, limits of control, limits of safe interaction. In this sense, permanence was the most honest response available. It did not promise safety beyond what could be delivered. It did not claim mastery. It acknowledged that some systems, once recognized, must simply be managed without expectation of change. Annabelle became a case defined not by action, but by refusal. Refusal to engage, to test, to provoke, to seek closure where none could be earned. This is why Annabelle remains locked away. Not because investigators expect something dramatic to happen, but because nothing needs to happen for risk to exist. The system persists quietly. The response must do the same. The story of Annabelle does not end with containment. It stabilizes there. And in cases like this, stabilization is not a temporary phase. It is the conclusion.